So this year during night quals, I posed a question of why do we scan after a string of fire? And resoundingly, the answer was twofold. One was to look for additional threats. And the second reason we scan, or that we've been taught to scan, is so that we can break our tunnel vision. I disagree with this. I don't disagree that scanning is important, but I disagree for the reasons that that maybe you were taught to scan or that I was taught to scan back in the academy. First, to look for additional threats. Well, I do believe it's important to think worst case scenario when it comes to doing your job, and if there's one bad guy, there's two, if there's two, there's three. I don't think that it makes a lot of sense to be taking my eyes off my initial bad guy just because I want to look and see who is on my six. So let me give you some numbers real quick. When I think of being involved in a deadly force encounter and having to use my weapon and having a threat in front of me and then another threat popping up on my rear, I think of two different occasions, two different scenarios, and that's going to be active shooter and then an LEO or law enforcement ambush. Now, some people, when I asked this question during training, said, well, what about domestics or armed robberies? And yep, I completely agree that you can have multiple bad guys in an armed robbery, home invasion, but I really think that they're kind of on one side of the field and we're on the other side of the field, or one side of the court. I use dodgeball as an analogy. So when you look at the most famous bank robbery ever, the North Hollywood shootout, those cops were responding and they encountered the two bad guys on their side of the dodgeball court. And those guys were laying hate on the cops that responded, but the cops that were there were not checking their six constantly. You can watch the video because it's even in Hollywood movies at this point. They were concerned about the primary threat, which is the threat that was in front of them. Those two bad guys were not attempting to outflank and get behind the cops. They were not trying to ambush them. They were trying to get away. They were caught in a commission of a crime. And so when I think about most multiple bandit scenarios, I think that is most likely what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at two guys getting caught in the commission of crime, or more guys, and they're going to be on their side of the dodgeball court, and the cops or first responders are going to be on the other side of the dodgeball court. When I think about when I might really need to be checking my six for an additional threat, to me, the most highly likelihood or the most prevalent scenario that I can come up with was an active shooter scenario. And in an active shooter scenario, in my mind, what I'm envisioning is I come into a school or into a mall, I put a guy down, and on my six or behind me is his partner, and I have to keep my head on a swivel and be looking for that guy. So I did some research with Tom, and we looked into it. And according to the FBI, from 2000 to 2018, they reported 277 active shooter events. I thought, okay, that's a pretty fair number. How many of those active shooter events have multiple bad guys? And the answer, in almost 2 decades of active shooters, is 4. There was only 4 occasions of multiple bad guys in an active shooter event. So I don't think statistically it makes sense that if I am responding to an active shooter and I find him, that there is a high likelihood that there is somebody behind me. Now again, I do believe in preparing for worst case scenario, but I'm only talking about the numbers here. According to the Department of Justice, from 2001 to 2016, so a 17-year time span, they classified the most dangerous ambushes on law enforcement officers as being perpetrated by single bad guys. So when I think about scanning for an additional threat, on a statistical level, I don't think it makes a lot of sense. Now I do agree that we need to be playing that what if game, and we need to be getting ready for the worst case scenario. And I'm definitely not telling you that you should not be scanning, but I think that we should be scanning differently. Now the second reason that we've been taught to scan after a course of fire is to break tunnel vision. I want to talk real quick about what tunnel vision really is. So our body is made up of the autonomic nervous system. The enteric's all about digestion, so it's not really important for this conversation. The sympathetic nervous system is where our fight or flight response resides. That is where The crap has hit the fan and our brains have detected stress. Specifically, when our brains detect stress in the environment or a danger in the environment and we are faced with a stressful situation, we have, in layman's term, the fight or flight condition kicking in. But it's called the HPA axis. That's the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal gland axis. When your body detects stress, or I should say when your brain detects stress, it wakes up your hypothalamus, which sends a message to your pituitary gland, which wakes up your adrenal gland. Your adrenal gland is then going to release chemicals into your blood and into your body. It's going to release epinephrine, adrenaline, cortisol, and you're going to have physiological changes. And we discuss these changes, and you guys know what these changes are. You're going to lose digital dexterity. You're going to have tunnel vision. You're going to have auditory exclusion. You're going to have energy in your large muscle groups, and you are going to have your breathing increase and your heart rate increase. Your blood pressure is going to go up. So all of these things are going to happen. So with all of this chemical release and this reaction in your body to the stressful environment, how does looking side to side change the chemical makeup or that HPA axis's continued response? It doesn't. When people talk about tunnel vision, they're talking about a term called myidrasis. And in myidrasis, what happens is your pupils actually dilate. More light gets through to your iris. Your cones reconfigure shape, and you get a greater visual acuity centered in your field of view. Everything on the side can get kind of blurry or fuzzy, or maybe even become non-existent. People have talked about looking through a toilet paper roll or even through a soda straw, and that is their field of view. So with that as our field of view, if I'm looking side to side, is that going to widen that field of view? No, it's going to change my point of focus. It's going to change what I'm looking at. So yes, I will be able to see things that I wouldn't had I not looked side to side, but it's not going to actually open up my vision. Now with that, let's talk about auditory exclusion. So Johns Hopkins researchers attempted to create tunnel vision in humans, and they couldn't create tunnel vision or myidrasis without also creating auditory exclusion. And then they attempted to create auditory exclusion without creating tunnel vision, and they couldn't. And so what they found is that these are linked. All these things happen in concert with each other. We can't separate one part of the physiological response of the HPA axis from another. Now, things are going to be different for each of us. The way we respond to a stressful environment will be different. Our training experience will be different. Based on that level of training and experience, we're going to have a measure of stress inoculation, which allows us to be better prepared for the oh crap scenario. After my shooting in Eagle Mountain, I would have answered anybody who asked that no, I had no tunnel vision. I was not looking through a soda straw or through a toilet paper roll. If they asked if I had auditory exclusion after the shoot, I also would have said no. I was able to talk with Kurt. I was able to hear what he said. I was able to hear several things. The gunshot itself was quiet, but I was suppressed. My rifle was suppressed, and I just assumed that was working well. And no, I didn't have tunnel vision. I didn't have auditory exclusion. After my interview, and after I was able to talk with people who were on scene, they said, no, Brett, that was really loud. Now, these weren't guys that were in the house with me. These are guys that were outside. So people outside the house, so that gunshot was very loud. So I learned 3 days after the shoot, I had auditory exclusion. And so did I have tunnel vision? Absolutely. To what degree was that tunnel vision? I don't know. Because, like I said, I never would have thought that I had tunnel vision. It's very safe to assume that every single one of us in the right circumstance can be faced with a staggering degree of tunnel vision or hyperfocus or tunneled senses or whatever we should want to call it. So my question is, if I am forced to employ deadly force with my handgun or with a rifle or with any weapon system onto bad guy A, we'll call him bad guy A, how quick do I want to look away from him? If we think about law enforcement shootings and we look at the percentages for hits in a law enforcement shooting, there really is no entity tracking these statistics on a national level. But if we are going to look at that, I have heard numbers from the mid-teens to the high teens. So let's just go ahead and go with a 20% hit rate. That's the same number that we use in the training. So with a 20% hit rate, if I fire my gun 20 times, that means I may hit my target 4 times. So out of those 4 hits, what are the chances that one of those rounds was a central nervous system incapacitating round, completely shut off the computer and truly neutralize my threat to the point where I don't have to worry about what they do next? I have no idea. I would say that that number is very low. Let's say that me and my 4 buddies, we each fire 20 shots at the same bad guy. So we fire 100 rounds. We get a 20% hit rate. So we have 20 rounds hit them. What are the chances that one of those rounds actually shut the computer down? Let's say 10%. So let's say that we have 2 rounds that actually hit the computer, hit the brain, and stop them. So we are at a 1% or 2% chances of actually shutting down the computer in a gunfight. Now, I'm making these numbers up, but my point is that it's extremely low. We may have a shooting where cops shoot 5 times and hit them in the shoulder and in the forearm, and that's the extent of their hits. And the bad guy decides he wants to give up. So that was a successful end to the gunfight for law enforcement. Bad guy stopped his activities and is willing to put down his gun or put down his weapon. So was it effective fire? Absolutely. Is he still a threat, or is she still a threat just because they no longer want to fight? Of course they're still a threat. Of course that chance exists that they're going to re-engage, that they are going to decide that, hey, I sucked up some rounds, but I can keep fighting. There's also the chance that they are going to, that they have been playing possum and they have been pretending to be out of the fight, trying to sucker law enforcement out of a tactical position or a position of cover concealment. So if I'm engaged with you in a deadly force encounter and you're the bad guy and you go down, the question I ask, how quick do I want to take my eyes off you? How quick would you want to take your eyes off me if you just engaged me in a deadly force encounter? I think the answer is, and not until I'm 100% certain that they're no longer a threat. That may be when I can see gray matter on the concrete, or that may be when I have them in handcuffs and they have been searched and they're no longer a threat to anybody. So the habit of coming up and shooting and then completing the string of fire and then looking side to side, I think is a bad habit to be in. And I think most of you guys actually experienced that as we were going through the qualification and training. You found it a hard habit to not get back to your holster. But like I told you then, there's no prize for first place back to the holster. We don't get anything for being the first one to the holster. If there is a bad guy out there who makes me draw my gun and makes me put rounds downrange at him, I should be very reluctant to want to actually go back to my holster. It should not be a how fast can I get back there kind of deal. Now the next question that I asked everybody is, if you get in a shooting tomorrow, what's the next thing you do after you pull the trigger? I don't know. And that's the answer I'm looking for, because I didn't give enough information in the scenario to actually decide what you should do next. But there isn't any one answer that is going to be universal and it's going to be across the board for every scenario, a must do. I asked a senior person in each of the trainings how many times they have been on the course of fire or on the line of fire, and after a course of fire have scanned and looked side to side and been thinking about traffic. And not once did anybody answer in the affirmative. Not once did anybody say, oh yeah, I'm used to looking side to side, looking at traffic. But the reality of it is that if somebody makes a traffic stop on the freeway and there's a single person in the vehicle and they have to shoot that person, and that person is dead and there is gray matter on the windshield and their gun is on the floor and they were the only occupant in the car, my question is, well, what is the next biggest threat to that officer's safety? And that answer is traffic. So I think it's very important that we don't tie ourselves to any particular action after a course of fire. I think it's important that we are smart about what we do after a deadly force engagement. So what does that mean? That means that we have to be cognizant of our surroundings, and we have to be able to make decisions. When we talked about the fight or flight syndrome or the HPA axis, we were talking about the sympathetic nervous system. What we need to do is we need to get out of the sympathetic nervous system, and we need to get back into a parasympathetic state. What happens in a parasympathetic state is we are actually able to think, to observe, to recognize, to be cognitive, to be problem solvers. And after any course of fire, any use of deadly force, we're going to need to be problem solvers. And if I got shot in my leg, and I have got a femoral bleed, and it takes 20 seconds for me to put down the bad guy, for me to finish the fight, I don't think that I need to start scanning for another bad guy immediately. I don't think I need to get on the radio immediately. I've got 20 seconds of a femoral bleed. I need to get a tourniquet on immediately. If there has been a child hurt or in the gunfire between you and a bad guy, what takes precedence? You applying medical to the bad guy, or you applying medical to the child? We all know the answer to that. But how will we know that a child's been hurt if that child was hit by a round that went over our shoulder and struck them behind us? Well, the answer would be, well, when you scan. But when you scan, what are you looking for? You're looking for additional threats, right? That's what I was taught, and that's probably what you were taught as well. And you've had that ingrained in your head for years and years and years, that you are scanning for threats. I believe the reason we should be scanning is to obtain information about our surroundings, is to obtain information to help us make the best decision possible. Now, if we are in that fight or flight or sympathetic nervous system's HPA axis response, rational thought is not going to be what prevails. We're going to be using our animal brain. We're going to be responding and going through the motions, going through the training exercises that we have done, whatever that may be. If we actually are going to try and be tactical thinkers or try and make the best decisions possible, we are going to need to try and slow that HPA response and try and unhyper-focus our brain. We're going to need to try and get ourselves back into a parasympathetic state. So there's only two things that exist in the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system's condition that we have the ability to immediately control. And you all know one of them is breathing. The other one is blinking. But I want to focus on breathing, because when we talk about breathing, we talk about being able to, or as soon as we talk about breathing, what does every single person do? They start being aware of how they're breathing, of how long they're inhaling, how long they're exhaling. So breathing is part of the sympathetic or fight or flight condition that is going to run rampant. It's going to kind of take off on us. But we have the ability to immediately control it. Now, just because we control it doesn't mean that we've completely stopped all of those chemicals and hormones from being released into our body, but we are taking control of our sympathetic nervous system by pushing the parasympathetic nervous system back into the forefront. So with combat breathing, I've heard it described as a 4-second inhale, a 4-second hold, a 4-second exhale, and a 4-second hold. The reality is, it doesn't matter if it's 4, 4, and 4, 2, 2, and 2, 3, 3, and 3. What's really important is that we take cognizant control and we actually think about the breathing. By thinking about the breathing, we're going to change the parts of our brains the synapses in our brain that are firing, and we're going to be able to calm ourselves down. We've all at some point responded to a hot call or a hot situation where you can feel your breathing escalating, your heart rate pumping, and what have we all done? Because we've gone through the academy and we've gone through simulation training and force on force training. What have we done? We've utilized breathing exercises. We've utilized breathing exercises in order to calm ourselves down. When you have a child or a loved one who is crying and is inconsolable and you're not able to get the story of what's wrong out, what do? hey buddy, hey sweetheart, go ahead and calm down. Let's take some deep breaths together. Why do we have them do that? We have them do that because we know, maybe on a subconscious level, if not a conscious level, that we can actually get them to be rational and more calm by pulling them from the sympathetic and helping them to get back into a parasympathetic nervous system state. The question of what do you do after a deadly force encounter? I don't know. The situation is going to have to dictate your tactics. But if you don't know what you should do, I think the answer is breathe. I think the answer is take some deep breaths, do some combat breathing, calm yourself, and gain control of your senses. And then when it comes time to scan, how should we scan? We're going to do what we call an active scan. So if this is my bad guy and this is me, I'll point my hand like this so you can kind of see it. So I shoot this guy and he goes down. I don't need to immediately look left and right in order to see what's going on around me. If I've got a down bad guy right here, I might be able to advance around him and move kind of like a toilet bowl flushes and moves around him so that I can actually obtain visual information of my surroundings without taking my focus off him. So if I am tunnel vision like this and I want to keep seeing something, I'm going to have to move around and keep that in my primary threat in my field of focus or my field of view. And as I move around and I'm breathing, I'm able to hopefully widen this out as I calm down and as I bring myself back into a parasympathetic state. Also in doing this, I'm not going to run the risk of having a mistake of fact. So if I am scanning for the sole purpose of looking for additional threats, then my brain potentially could play the worst case scenario on me. And when I see somebody who's got a cell phone in their hand, I might see it as a gun. But if I am looking around and scanning to obtain information, then I'm not prejudicing my mind and saying, oh, well, everyone who's got something in their hand is a threat. I am looking for good guys, I'm looking for bad guys, I'm looking for cover, I'm looking for concealment, I'm looking for all sorts of things. But by not narrowing the focus of my brain, it's going to give me the opportunity to actually see what's going on around me. And in being active and actually moving my feet, it's going to allow me to keep my weapon pointed at my bad guy, my primary threat. Because if he was my primary threat and I shot 5 times, so that means statistically with my 20% average, I only hit him 1 time and he's down on the ground. What are the chances that one hit actually shut down the computer? Pretty stinking low, pretty low. So if I've shot 5 rounds and I've hit him 1 time, how quick do I want to take my eyes off him? I don't. But do I need to look around and see what's going on around me? Yeah, absolutely, I do. But I'm going to do that keeping him in my field of view, whether it's this or whether this is my field of view. If this is my field of view, I may be able to get away with a pretty good turn and scan and still be able to see him at all times. If this is my field of view, I'm not going to have a whole lot of play, so I'm going to have to move my feet. For the purposes of the qual range, I said, look, we can't move in a 3-dimensional world on the qual range, because that qual range has to kind of exist in a 2-dimensional world. I've got shooters on my left and my right, and if I'm aggressing or they're aggressing and I am retreating and we're moving side to side, then we're going to put ourselves in a dangerous position. So when it comes to the course of fire, when that target turns away, that simulates the bad guy falling down. I can then index my finger off the trigger because I'm no longer preparing to fire because he's fallen down, maybe he dropped the gun, whatever scenario, or knife, whatever scenario makes sense to you in your head, I index. While I'm indexing, I'm going through a series of combat breathing. Once I've done 1 or 2 cycles of combat breathing with my weapon still pointed at my primary threat, and I've decided that, okay, he's not going to be a threat, he's not going to require an immediate additional round, I can start to move around him to obtain more information about my surroundings. So that may be that I actually move the other side of his body, or maybe I stand there breathing, waiting for my partner to show up. The situation must dictate your tactics. Your tactics can't be pre-planned, and you can't do the same thing every time.
Threat! So here we have our standard quick look and reholster. Threat. Breathing. He's going to holster, that is just for purposes of this video, and then he's going to hold his hands as if that was his field of view. That is what he's actually able to see. So as he's moving, you can see he's shifting and scanning, but he's not losing visual of his primary bad guy while he's doing this. He's able to look left, look right. He's moved around the target so we can see things that were behind him, but he's never taken his eyes or focus off that initial bad guy. When he finishes that cycle, he'll start again and then begin moving side to side in an active scan method. At this point right now, we're just having to stay focused on side to side because this is going to be a 90-degree range with other people around. So we would not be able to move in an arc safely.